Hey folks, welcome back to the Stardock Entertainment Software channel, and we're going to be talking to the designer of Sins of Solar Empire 2, Sovereign Echo. Welcome back to the channel.
Hello, it's good to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while since we last spoke, but there's been some really cool stuff come out in the world of Sins of Solar Empire 2 in the time since we've last spoken, and most pertinently, I think, is the Reinforcements DLC, which we released a month ago or so. And I would like to pick your brains on these command ships that you've created, because I understand that you've got quite a lot to say on this topic.
I certainly do. These ships are very much my baby.
So, Conor, the first thing I want to ask you is, where do these new ships sit in the hierarchy of the existing ship structure? So, I mean, obviously, size-wise, they're below the Titan and they're bigger than capital ships.
So first and foremost, they were designed to exemplify the faction's fighting styles and ideologies, both in their appearance, battlefield role, and gameplay mechanics. Each of them does this very differently. So it's difficult to talk about all of them as a whole. Much easier to focus on each individual one and how it fits into each of its faction's rosters in that respect.
Okay, so it wasn't like a general issue necessarily. It was that each of the specific factions all have their own unique gameplay, and there were elements that you could enhance or maybe correct by adding this new sort of feature into the game.
Yeah, we went in knowing that we definitely wanted to put a ship in that 100 supply place in between the Titan and the capital ship. So that part of the design process was locked in even before we considered what they would be. That's more about providing an interesting new space than it is about fixing any individual problem. But once we decided that, it was from there that we then moved forward to try to exemplify both the lore and the gameplay mechanics of each of the sub-factions.
I was actually going to ask you how important it was that the design of these ships, these new ships, fit into the existing sort of lore of Sins of a Solar Empire 2, or the Sins of a Solar Empire universe in general. Now, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we talk about each of the individual ships. But I guess in a general sense, would you say that it was an important decision, or it was a challenge in order to get these new ships, kind of like feeling like they're part of the living, breathing universe and exemplifying the factions that they represent?
It was definitely important, yeah. And we also wanted to move forward the timeline a little bit with these ships. So obviously Sins 2 is set further into the timeline than Sins Rebellion was, but we didn't really have all that many new ships to exemplify how the factions had evolved since Sins Rebellion. And this is our first major step in that direction. And we'll come to how that works for each faction as we touch on each individual ship.
Okay, so let's start with the TEC Kavarakov. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this ship, how it came to be, and what it does in the game.
Yes, the Kavarakov. This is the continuation of the concept of the TEC now building dedicated warships, but also leveraging their industrial might to ensure that those dedicated warships can handle any circumstance they run into. So with the Kavarakov, our early design principle around it was that we wanted to make use of the ability of Sins 2 to have modular weapons, customizable aspects to your ship. This is a really fun mechanic that we haven't really used to perhaps its fullest extent elsewhere in the game, but with these new ships it presented the perfect opportunity. And so right from the very start, the Kavarakov was designed around the concept of choosing your own loadout.
Okay, and so this kind of modular idea, this stems from the fact that, as you've alluded to, the TEC, they had to rapidly adapt to the Visari invasion, right? And so they were modifying their peaceful trade fleet, essentially, into warships. But the Kavarakov, that's a different beast entirely, right?
Yes, this ship is designed from the keel up for war and nothing else. The TC do have a few ships already that are that way, like the Cole, for example, and their Titans as well. But this ship represents a new, more mass-producible ship for the TEC primacy that really exemplifies their way of war. Fundamentally, with the primacy, it was almost too simple to design. They're all about destroying the Xenos, and the Deviants. And, well, how better to do that than with a vast selection of guns? And, of course, the Ragnarov is already a gun with engines, with guns attached. So how can we possibly expand on that? That's where the modularity comes in. The modularity is not just about selecting the weapons, it's also about customizing the abilities of the Kvarkov. Its signature ability, Modular Overdrive, changes its effect depending on which of the major weapon slots you have equipped. And because you can change these weapons, potentially even in battle, if the battle lasts long enough, this provides a degree of tactical and operational flexibility to the primacy that otherwise they sometimes lack.
Right, so that if you come across a challenge that they weren't expecting, that Visari fleet phase jumps in from a direction you're not expecting, or suddenly there's a load of advent on your door and they've got a huge amount of missile ships or something, you've got some chance of being able to counter that in a specific way with this ship, because if you catch these threats early enough, you can potentially change those weapons round and rebuild them essentially on the ship just in time to be able to face this threat.
Yes, indeed. The ship was also built to exemplify the concept of the battle cruiser as well. It's fast, it has an ability to make its accompanying fleet even faster, and more so than any of the other command ships, this one likes to hunt in a pack of its own kind. 3 Kvarkovs running around with railguns can reduce a starbase to slag in moments. 3 Kvarkovs with full missile build can overwhelm just about any point defense grid you can imagine. 3 Kvarkovs spec'd for carrier duties. There's a massive number of strike craft on a platform that can escape from threats that could challenge it very easily.
I see. So it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of the TEC primacy. And it's interesting too that it has a speed focus, because that's one of the things that will differentiate this ship from the Ragnarov Titan in a big way, is that that's kind of slow, ponderous, but very, very powerful with its weapon loadout. Whereas the Kvarkov is faster, and it's perhaps going to be maybe used in a sense of a quick strike fleet, something that can actually potentially flank larger forces, that kind of thing.
Yes, it does still live up to its title as a command ship, because just as much as it likes to fight in packs of its own kind, it could easily lead a fleet and make use of its mobility-enhancing aura to allow the primacy to be in multiple places at once, something that the Ragnarov just couldn't do. Now, the Ragnarov is still unparalleled in terms of its firepower on a point, but the Kvarkov adds some subtle nuance to the primacy that they were lacking before.
So let's move to the Visari Salarkan Tyrant. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this absolute beast of a ship.
Well, the Visari command ships are interesting, and I'll cover the lore for both of them now, I think, to some degree. With the Visari, all of their most powerful and large units are basically ancient remnants from the time of the original Visari Empire. They're not new designs from the point of view of the Visari having put together blueprints and constructed them. They're calling these ancient vessels in from the Dark Fleet. In the case of both the Sulakon Tyrant and the Anarkul Wanderer, these ships are the arc ships of the Visari fleet. Massive vessels housing countless Visari civilians that, until recently, the Visari considered to be far too valuable and too precious to risk in battle. But as the Visari Dark Fleet has begun to overrun trade order space, and they're becoming ever more fearful of the thing that might be pursuing them, they have decided that these ships are sufficiently powerful that they have to risk them in battle now. Now, the Sulakon Tyrant in particular was originally, during the days of the Visari Empire, a mobile sector capital. So the Jarosol Evacuator ruled over a single planet from orbit, and the Sulakon Tyrant ruled over numerous Jarosols that would rule over planets. This was a center of administration and order for the Visari Empire. It was also an icon and a tool of terror. This ship was built to provide a central point for rebels to attack, a very obvious location for anyone that was against the Visari Empire to try to destroy them. And so it looks relatively lightly armed, but it has some powerful terror-causing capabilities, most notably in the nano-culling ability, which will destroy ships that are already heavily damaged extremely rapidly. Also, an important aspect for the Sulakon Tyrant is its mobile phase gate. Now, this begins the game when you call it in destroyed. You have to restore the mobile phase gate, but if you can, you gain a degree of strategic mobility that is unparalleled. Several Sulakon Tyrants moving around the map can easily link multiple places together, even outside of the safety of the normal Visari phase gate network.
So this leans into the Visari's playstyle of raids coming from unexpected directions and just unexpected mobility in general.
Yes. Now, you might be asking, why is terror-causing ship, the icon of governance, aligned with the Visari Alliance faction? Well, basically, to put it simply, this ship has a huge capacity for people and not all that much cargo capacity. So the Visari Exodus faction just didn't really consider it as valuable to them as they did the Wanderer. Whereas for the Visari Alliance, who are concerned with saving not just the Visari, but also humans, this was the ideal platform for them to acquire and bring into their fleet. And that's why the Visari Alliance calls in the Sulakon Tyrant and not the Anarchral Wanderer.
And this, again, sort of leans into the Visari Alliance's playstyle of generally buffing the planets and providing bonuses to things like diplomacy and diplomatic ties, I guess, with the other factions in the game.
Yeah, and the Tyrant has a few items on board that support this as well. It can act as a mobile center for minor faction raids, providing minor faction radius, and it can also spread culture. And these both tie into the way that the Visari Alliance likes to operate. They want to set up control and establish rulership over the local space. They just aren't usually quite as ruthless or destructive about the Exodus are. And so an icon of control and terror actually works quite well for them when they need to expose the iron fist inside the velvet glove, as it were.
Let's move on to the Advent Justicia.
So this is perhaps the most complex of all of the command ships. This is the Advent Reborn command ship, and the Advent Reborn are about two primary things: purification and power from sacrifice. So the Justicia is, if you'll permit me a D&D analogy for a moment, something of a necromancer paladin multi-class.
Okay.
Bit of a strange one, but that's the Reborn for you. So this ship is built around a massive soul reservoir on its back, and primarily it's about keeping its own craft alive and ensuring that when they die, that their energy is not lost. Their souls are reclaimed and put to better use. Exactly how you make use of those souls is something you can customize with unique items on the Justicia.
And so what are the options that you get with the Justicia? Because obviously this, in the command ship space, it needs to be something that has real punch when it comes to combat, but obviously it's not going to be trying to occupy the same space as a Titan, right? So how do its abilities work and synergize with the ships that you're presumably going to be surrounding it with?
Well, if you compare it with the Erratica, the Reborn Titan, the Erratica is more about destroying the enemy and selfishly consuming its friendly forces to power itself. The Justicia is more support-oriented. It can keep its forces alive with Reinvigorate and provide further buffs to them in other ways. It can control enemy ships using Judgment, especially enemy Titans and capital ships, which is not restricted at all from targeting using Judgment, which greatly disrupts their abilities and deals a small amount of direct to hull damage. But its perhaps most iconic and flashy abilities are Harvest and Flare, With Harvest, it can increase its own antimatter stores as nearby friendly ships are destroyed. This builds into Reborn's tendency to want to build more of the smaller Advent ships that might suffer significant casualties in battle. And once it's built up sufficient antimatter reserves, it can burn them all at once using the Flare ability, its ultimate, to deal damage based on how much antimatter it is built up. This has an incredibly high ceiling and can potentially act as a fleet wipe ability, but it has a lot of hoops you have to get through to get it to that level. This synergizes particularly with the Reborn's resurrection capabilities as well, in that, yes, they will lose a lot of ships powering these abilities, but then they can just bring them back through the power primarily of the progenitor mothership, but also the Unity ability, Resurrection.
Right, and so this allows you to kind of potentially throw lots of smaller ships into the battle, do a lot of damage, they'll die, they'll power your abilities, and then you bring them back again, repeat.
Yes, exactly. It forces difficult decisions onto the enemy. Do they want to clear out your DPS dealers and the smaller ships and risk powering up a Justicia? Or do they want to target the Justicia first? It can potentially act as a fleet shield by its sheer threatening presence alone. But if they're shooting at a single large vessel like the Justicia, then they're not destroying your smaller stuff. And so it's a win-win for the Reborn.
Yeah, okay, and to use a term from other games genres, it's kind of what you'd call a nitaku or a two-choice situation, isn't it?
Yes.
I bet you never thought you would hear a fighting game analogy talking about Sins of a Solar Empire.
I take it as a compliment.
That is actually an interesting thing, because I think that games should be about player choice, but to force a choice on someone in an offensive way, to kind of force your opponent to make a choice like that. Sins has lots of these opportunities, but I think the Justicia really kind of exemplifies this with its abilities. And, you know, like, do you try to take out the Justicia? Do you try to take out the smaller ships knowing that you're going to do damage? Just as you've explained, I think that's an interesting choice for sure.
Yeah, and this is very much exemplifying the gameplay side of the Reborn faction. They're the most complex of the factions, the most synergy hungry, but also the most focused on mind games with your opponent.
Right, and I guess they're one of the most micro-intensive as well, I'd say.
They certainly can be, yes.
Sins isn't a huge micro-intensive game necessarily. It's certainly not about actions per minute, but in terms of, you know, active use abilities, I think the Advent factions in general seem to... the other factions are catching them up, actually, with some of the new abilities that are starting to come in, but the Advent certainly seem to have more of a focus on the active use ability, so you have to kind of be a little bit more on it and plan ahead.
Yes. Advent are the synergy faction and generally considered the most complex of the factions from a technical standpoint. So there certainly are complex in abilities. But the Justicia is designed such that if you don't want to interact with that, or maybe you want to focus your micro attention elsewhere, you can build it in a more passive way. So, for example, Reinvigorate and Judgment are both abilities that will run on their autocasts just fine without you involving yourself. So you could just spec them for that and not worry about Flare or any of the more complex stuff going on with the Justicia.
Absolutely, and as when we come to look at the Advent Oblivia at the end, we'll see that there's a very different design principle there. But for now, we're going to move to the TEC Takadaran.
Yes, the mobile command fortress. The Takadaran is a purpose-built warship as well, but in a very different respect to the Kivakov. With the Enclave, they have a huge variety of defensive tools already, including the Ankelon, which is their Titan and already virtually indestructible as far as individual ships go. So where does the Takadaran come into it? Well, the Ankelon is all well and good, but it doesn't really interact with the garrison mechanics of the Enclave. And so the Takadaran was built to enable both defensive garrison gameplay across a wide battlefront, and also to enable expeditionary attacks with the proper battle fleet of the TEC Enclave, in a way that the Ankelon doesn't. It's not anywhere near as individually formidable in combat, but as a command ship at a factory, it provides a degree of operational and strategic flexibility that the Ankelon doesn't. It can build ships all the way up to cruiser class, including the Ogrov torpedo cruiser, which is quite useful if you're in an expeditionary attack and you run into a starbase you need to destroy, or if you need to simply just replace the attrition that TEC attacks inevitably face. On the defense, its factory can contribute to garrison construction, especially of cruisers, and its abilities are oriented around supporting and improving smaller ships and static defenses. On top of that, as a command ship, it's likely to attract the ire of the enemy at every turn, and so it has an interesting synergistic defensive ability in the form of magnetic overshield, which allows it to use its antimatter reserve as a secondary defensive HP pool. Combine that with the Hashiko Robotics Cruiser's regeneration droids, and it can potentially keep going and going and going when it's under fire.
So one thing I'm noticing with all of these command ships so far, and consistent with the design of Sins of Solar Empire 2 in general, is that each of the factions now can really lean into a sort of OP style of play if you really min-max in a certain way. But these are balanced out by the fact that every faction has got some OP stuff, right? So, that's the way to balance OP things, in my opinion. Rather than nerfing everything down so everything's kind of got the edges sanded off, it's actually better and more fun to just give other factions, some OP stuff as well, and then try to balance them together as they're used. The Takedaran's interesting because you're allowing to really lean into this garrison play by just doubling the output of a garrison fleet, for example, at various points. And you can get 3 of these things. So, if you've got these things moving between your various planets that you're trying to defend, it's an incredibly overpowered defensive force. But also it can go on the offensive too. And you're using this to actually create maybe a bulwark in an enemy system. So you can land in an enemy system and start pumping out ships, right? And it might not be a particularly well-defended enemy system, and it turns into one of your systems even before you've taken the planet.
Exactly. And it exemplifies the flexibility of the TEC in a completely different way to the Kvarkov. You can build anything up to a cruiser from this, so you can react to the enemy's fleet composition in the middle of the battle.
Yes, and that's some surprising flexibility that you would expect from somewhere like the Visari with their superb strategic maneuverability, but now the TEC can actually work to counter that. And it also mirrors a little bit how the Kvarkov works too, because that has this ability to actually build weapons to face different threats as they come, whereas the Takedaran can just build whole new ships.
Exactly.
So let's move on to the Visari Anarchral Wanderer. That's the next on our list of command ships to talk about.
Yes. So, the Anarchral Wanderer, as I said earlier, is one of the Visari's prized arc ships. Now, in the days of the Visari Empire, this was more of a resource allocation and gathering and transport vessel. It was built to be fast, well defended, but it's not really designed for combat. In the modern day, the Visari Exodus faction makes use of its cavernous internal volume and flexible internal systems to set up infrastructure modules inside of the vessel and allow their fleet to operate without the need for planets on a greater level than they already could. Most of its abilities are extremely defensively oriented, in that if they put a mobile rulership on board this vessel, they really want to keep it alive. Normally this would be limited only to the Titan, but Titans have a lot of requirement and demand on their item slots. So I wanted to create a new place for the Visari to stack up infrastructure modules when they're trying to take their empire fully mobile and abandon the use of planets. That's the primary use for the Anarchral Wanderer, but it's not the only use. You see, while it may not be especially well armed, and while its abilities may not be especially destructive, except for its ultimate, it does have vast hangar bays and the ability to boost its strikecraft even further. So this acts as something of a super carrier for the Visari. And using its mobility, it can get in and get out of sticky situations and make use of its massive strikecraft complement to deal considerable damage. Of course, it wouldn't be a Visari ship without some way of generating resources of its own. That's where the Nano Devourer comes in. This is an ancient Visari weapon that was until recently considered to be too horrific to use in battle. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and the Exodus faction of all of the factions perhaps care the least for the use of such horrific weapons as the Nano Devourer. This self-replicating nanite swarm will rapidly destroy even a starbase, converting it into resources for the Visari, and then spreading further around into the enemy fleet. It does have a kill switch built in, limited duration. I mean, the Visari are not that insane, but when it is active, it is massively destructive. This is the ultimate ability for the Anarchal, though, so you'll need to put a little bit of work into getting access to it.
But the payoff is significant because I've seen that thing eat fleets, literally.
Yes, indeed.
So I think that this is going to be another tool in the Visari's toolbox, and it's definitely one that's going to encourage them to be moving, into that mobile rulership playstyle towards the end of the game. And that's already a big part of the Visari Exodus, right? That you have this option. It's not necessarily one you always want to take, but it is the option to be able to crush planets, turn them into resources, and then, you are on the move at that point. And often by that point of the game, you're into the end game, right? This makes it a much more dynamic end game playstyle rather than the TC Enclave, for example, who would be focusing on leveraging that super powerful economy to be able to build a final fleet to be able to take out their opponents.
Yeah, indeed. Now, of course, Exodus were able to go fully mobile before, but with the Anarchal Wanderer, they can now do so in a way that is smoother and safer than before, without necessarily having to dilute their capital ship and Titan force with infrastructure items. They'll still need to do that a little bit, but the Anarchal Wanderer provides a convenient way to centralize that level of empire management onto a single mobile asset.
That's great. And that frees up, for example, your Titan, because let's say that you had the mobile rulership on the Titan. Titans are always a target anyway, and they're a very powerful target and a well-defended target, but they're a target nonetheless. Now with the Anarchal Wanderer, you've got 3 ships that you could potentially hide your mobile rulership in. And so this makes I'd say the mobile playstyle a little bit more attractive, because it's not then just a game where everybody's just going to go for the Titan, right?
Exactly. And that's part of why the Anarchal Wanderer was built with relatively light weapons loadout, so that it didn't have a constant demand for its item slots to be used on more DPS, more survivability.
Okay, and before we wrap up, let's move on to the final of the command ships that we've not spoken about yet, which is the Advent Oblivia.
Yes. So this one was originally concepted as something of a siege battleship. You see, the Advent have some very powerful high pierce weapons in the form of plasma, but they didn't really have a single large weapons platform in the way that the other factions do. And for the Wrath faction, who are all about revenge and the destruction of their enemy, it really seemed like they should have something that was a little bit more brute force. Now, of course, this is the Advent. They have to have a few strange and weird and wonderful things. And so the Oblivia does. But fundamentally, it's about bringing a whole lot of very large plasma weapons to bear on the enemy and destroying them. It's by far the simpler of the 2 Advent command ships, but this mirrors the factions in that the Wrath tends to be a little bit more blunt in the way they assemble their synergy and make use of it. The Oblivia's signature ability, Psychokinetic Lance, is a damage ability, but also a physics ability. It can push enemy ships away from the Oblivia, which allows you to target a specific enemy and push them literally out of the battle. In many cases, this can break up an enemy formation, break their point defense grid, or ruin their synergies, without even necessarily destroying the target. Though, with sufficient psi power invested into the Oblivia, Psychokinetic Lance will destroy ships, and rapidly.
So this is great because it allows you to make space in the battlefield, and then you can move your own ships into to occupy those positions and reclaim that tactical advantage that your enemy had over you initially.
Indeed.
I've also seen the Advent Oblivia in my own games absolutely melt starbases. It just parks itself next to one, and the starbase disappears.
Yes, that's where the siege part of the siege battleship comes in. It is equipped with super heavy plasma on the front of the vessel, and in fact, these weapons are only capable of converging on a large target. Against a small target, it'll actually be forced to split its forward firepower out. And this was very intentional. The damage this thing can output to the front is massive, but so too must its targets be massive. And just to further exemplify that, its ultimate ability, Stasis Beam, will not only disable an enemy target for a long duration, but cause it to take more damage while disabled. This can be used even on very large enemies. And so the Oblivia is very much a big game hunter.
And that might give you some clues on how to tackle it as well if you're facing one down in a battle.
Yes, though it does have something of a vengeful surprise, depending on how you spec it. One of its abilities causes it to explode when it is destroyed for a large AoE damage pulse, which, while that won't destroy smaller vessels, will certainly annihilate any corvettes that you may have used to overwhelm its otherwise heavy weapons.
Very nice. Before we finish, I'd like to ask you very briefly about the Factional Victory Conditions. These are quite interesting, and they are tied into the command ships themselves.
Yes, so these victory conditions began as the thought of how do we allow the Visari to do what they keep saying they want to do, which is gather a lot of resources and leave the galaxy. And from there, we extrapolated out to think about what other unique conditions the factions might use to ensure their victory. This is just the beginning of our push towards more interesting victory conditions beyond simply annihilation and homeworld destruction. But for this one, we wanted to really tie in the unique aspects of each faction's goals in the galaxy. Now, some astute players may notice that these ultimately are much the same between each of the sub-factions. Well, that's because the sub-factions mostly do want the same things. There are nuances to what they would do after they won, or how they would go about winning, but ultimately, they are there to accomplish much the same thing as each other.
Is this something that you would say is kind of a work in progress, that you may be adding more?
We certainly want to add more victory conditions in general.
Yeah.
As to factional victory conditions, I think I'm quite proud with what we have already, though, of course, watch this space. I can't help but refine things over time.
That sounds good. Sovereign Echo, we're going to have to end the interview here. Thank you so much for your time. I really, really enjoy talking to you about this because you're clearly really passionate about the things that you've created for the game. And it must be really, really cool to be able to see the team put these ideas into the flesh, to manifest them into the game that we get to play.
Absolutely. And I do just want to thank the rest of the team as well. I feel a great deal of ownership over these ships, having come up with the core concept design for each and every one of them from the very start. But getting to watch everyone put their various specialties to work, bringing them to life, it was really quite something.
And as the video guy, right, I often get plenty of time to be able to sort of just look at the ship models because I'm trying to show, how cool these things look in terms of gameplay when we're playing the game. And so I've been just rotating these things and putting them into different lighting settings and looking at them. And the art team have done an absolutely amazing job in just making these things just really pop out. The detail is absolutely stunning on them.
Absolutely.
Right, Sovereign, we're going to end there. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And to everybody out there who's listening, I hope you're enjoying Sins of a Solar Empire 2 and you've checked out the Reinforcements DLC. If you've not, go over to Steam and check it out on the Steam store page and see what you think. Thanks again, Sovereign, and we'll catch you next time. See ya.
Bye.